Okay, good to see you again, and thanks for your reports behind you. Our reports.
Oh, yeah, no problem. I wanted to have a look through them in anticipation of our talk so that I could know what topics that would be interesting for us to discuss. So it's really good to see you again and talk with you again. I appreciate your time.
Oh, absolutely, and I really enjoyed the last conversation that we had. So I'm looking forward to today.
Yeah, I think we got off to a pretty good start last time. So I was hoping this time you wouldn't mind if we talked for a few minutes about how you got into this line of work and what maybe even back as far as where you grew up and how your studies and upbringing led you to this kind of work.
Thank you. And it's interesting when you just said the word studies and upbringing. I think it's my upbringing that led me to this work more than anything I studied.
Okay.
So I'm from Boston, and here in Massachusetts in the States, and grew up in a modest background, youngest of a family of 6. And on my mother's side, my grandparents were Irish immigrants who came to the United States when Ireland was not yet independent, still part of the United Kingdom. And I grew up with my grandmother and my grandfather, but particularly my grandmother, having very strong views of Irish independence and living under colonial state. And was very involved. I mean, this was before I was born, and a lot of activities here in the United States to promote Irish independence and the future of a country that was really meaningful to her. My mother was, in a sense, kind of a quiet activist. She wasn't a self-described activist, but she cared about issues. She cared about politics, local politics. And then for a lot of Irish Americans of that period, getting involved in local politics was how they got power and influence. And that was part of her, I think, upbringing. So I grew up with somebody who was very involved in local campaigns and elections. And I remember being brought, sometimes I felt like I was being dragged because I was less than 10 or 10 to rallies, anti-war rallies or demonstrations around civil rights and so forth. And it's funny because my mother would never fit the category of a classic activist, right? She did it in a very quiet way. And I wish she was alive today so I could ask her what motivated her. So it's kind of guessing and thinking about it. But I know that shaped me and my siblings in ways you don't really appreciate until you get older and look back. And so that's why I say it's really my upbringing, I think, prepared me and motivated me in subtle ways to actually be involved in making a difference on important issues. And when I started doing this work in the late 1980s, there were some courses on negotiation and conflict resolution, but not the robust field that now exists. That's really evolved over the last 4 decades. So I didn't actually study peace building, conflict resolution, or reconciliation. I studied history, and embedded within history are a lot of these things about how do you resolve conflict? How do you change a society? How do you deal with the legacy of the Second World War? Or the failure to do so, I guess, after the First World War? What happened in the United States after the Civil War and Reconstruction? So I guess through that, I was exposed to and thought about these issues. And yeah, so I grew up in that sort of background, but I also have come to realize that, at least in my path, it was kind of also like a calling, is the only way to describe it. It was like both not only a creative impulse, but also an impulse to actually do something about the world around you. Now, my world was not just here in Boston, the United States, even though I was very involved in local politics and state politics at one time. but out in the world, you know, what was happening in Central America in the mid and late 1980s, what was happening at the end of the Cold War in Europe and elsewhere. And that's when my sort of quiet activism started to really engage. Very much grounded in having an intuitive understanding of what it feels like to be marginalized, at times humiliated, excluded, but also that change, as difficult as it is to imagine in many ways, is possible. You know, that you could actually change your situation in a positive way in others that you know in a community. But, you know, when I look at the world today we're in and what's happening in this country, we have an election coming up in less than 12 months. What's happening right now in the Middle East is horrific to witness. What's been happening in Ukraine as well. And not to add, you know, more misery, but look at climate change, particularly in this past year, and other challenges we're facing. And so, you know, we're facing profound, in many cases, existential challenges. And it's almost like the failure to actually think about them in creative ways and address them have brought us to this point. And then I think I, like others, struggle with, where do we go from here? And I think I fall back in what I've learned over these 3.5 decades from incredible people around the world is it takes courage, it takes leadership, it takes, you know, a vision rooted in some profound, important values, but a recognition you can't do it alone. And I don't mean just on your side, but across the divides. So, sorry, I didn't mean to go on, but I was just thinking about your question, because it's not only what shaped me and where I'm from, but here now in this world, the issues we're dealing with, it's like, what have I learned? What have we collectively learned? And how do we challenge our own assumptions? Because if they were working, I think we'd be much better off right now, and a lot of them aren't.
I think the way you're talking there, you were going also towards dialogue as a means of addressing issues. And from what I've learned about your organization and what you guys do, the dialogue and the idea of shared experience is not just important, but a powerful tool for bringing people together. And I'm interested in, it seems to me that Beyond Conflict is involved in two different types of these experiences. One might be called truth and reconciliation, dealing with past traumas where former combatants or enemies are sitting down together, and one slightly different but related method is to get people together who have some shared experience. Maybe they're unrelated and from completely different conflicts or countries, but they come together and share their experiences, and this leads to something that I've read from the work you guys have done that you call lifting the veil of uniqueness. And and so am I right to see these two examples as slightly different but involving the same process?
Yeah, and yeah, thank you. It is the same process because whether we're dealing with how do we deal with the past of our country, or how do we build peace, or how do we face deep divides that are really crippling a society. Our approach has been that there's power in connecting with people who have been in similar situations before. What we call it is our shared experience methodology or approach. And it's, as I've said, it's like a big support group on wheels. You know, these are people who themselves have been in a similar situation, and not in a sort of clinical way, but a deeply emotional way. They know how difficult this is. And so the power of the shared experience model is it brings together people who are stuck. I would say in the United States, people are stuck with how do we break through this division? But in Northern Ireland and South Africa and Central America and many other places around the world, people were in similar situations, whether it's how do we end apartheid? How do we end decades of conflict in Northern Ireland, El Salvador, the conflict in the Balkans, and you can go on around the world. And things get so bad, they say there needs to be a better way, right? We've hit rock bottom, and we need to think differently and act differently. And other than often academic training, people don't get connected historically to people who've been in similar situations. And so what we since started in 1991, and it's grown, is not only for us, but for others, is bringing to bear the experience of people who understand how difficult this is, feel a moral obligation to support a community or a society, but also recognize that this is a sort of an accompanied process, because people will find it very difficult to sit across the table from their enemy, to sit across the table from somebody they think has profoundly offensive or destructive views. And yet there are people who found, in some cases, that's what they needed to do. And so I'd say one that connects all of this work is how other societies, rooted in the experience of individuals, dealt with the legacy of the past, particularly coming out of apartheid, where there was a democratic transition, or again, back in Northern Ireland. How do we actually build a peace process in this community? And so that's the thing that connects them all. And you mentioned dialogue, and in this country here in the United States, there's a lot of resistance, both on the left and the right, to dialogue, because it's like, is that to maintain the status quo? And the reality is, in my view, dialogue is a process, but it has to be rooted in something. What's the purpose of dialogue? Is dialogue about transformation, and what's required in that process and to reach that goal? Well, one is, you have to get to understand each other, and not just like what people's interests are at that time. Where do they come from? What shapes their point of view? What shapes their fears? What fears do their community have? And the one thing that all the research in brain and behavioral science and social studies, but even in experience, is the only way you deal with profound division is through cooperation, but cooperation where you have shared mutual gain. And as a friend of mine, brilliant scientist, Josh Green at Harvard, said to me, he teaches a course on cooperation, but he says, I rooted first in the biology of cooperation, the psychology of cooperation, and the social reality of cooperation. And he points out that even at a basic cellular level, life evolved on this planet through cooperation and mutual benefit. And you look at it at a deeply biological level. I mean, that's literally how life evolved on this planet, through cooperation. And then the same happens, in our psychology, why it's rooted in our psychology. But then where it starts to fall apart is also in our social, interactions, right? Oh, are we selling out? Or can't imagine I'll do it in X, Y, and Z. And so, again, bringing in the experience of others who are trying to navigate through that is one of the key things we try to do. And to your point, I think I said this before, lifting the veil of uniqueness. Is that people think and it's just the way we're kind of in a sense wired, is we think our situation is unique, right? It's just, it's particularly in deeply polarized, dysfunctional, conflicted, marginalized, whatever communities or families or individuals. There's a lot of, as a friend of mine in Belfast once said, navel contemplation. And to be able to stand back and literally lift up is to say, wait a minute, there's a veil here that prevents us from understanding that we're not alone,
Mm-hmm.
and that others have done that.
That particular point reminds me a little bit of a line from Tolstoy's novel Anna Karenina, that happy families are all alike, but I think it goes this way, but all unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. I think, or I imagine or guess that the complexity and trauma that people experience, they perhaps can't imagine that someone else would understand what they have gone through. But when they have the opportunity to sit down and exchange and share experiences, that
Mm-hmm.
do you see that there's what are people's reactions when they go through this process? Is there a form of healing, or is there this realization that it's not just me, other people have gone through this, and it's been helpful to be in dialogue with them?
I think it's very much depends on the context of the interaction. So I remember we, after the signing of the Dayton Peace Accords in 1995, were asked to, focus on reconciliation in Bosnia among the three communities, right? The Serb, the Muslim, and the Croat. And we did a conference in Belfast, I think it was 1995. And we brought leaders from the three communities. But we also brought in from the Middle East, all over the world, people who had recently come out of war or come out of apartheid. And at the outset, it was very difficult for the Bosnians in the room to sit at the same table with people they thought were war criminals, who carried out ethnic cleansing or genocide or killed members of their family. And there was so one was the discomfort, which was understood. And at one point, from the Bosnian Muslim community, the then prime minister and a couple other leaders just walked out when a Bosnian Serb leader spoke. And it was a Palestinian and Israeli woman who were speaking, and a follow-up session ran out, talked to them, and brought them back in because they understood what they were feeling. And there were people sitting there, and they were initially like, so how does this connect to our experience? But then they started listening to people. There was one person who said from, I don't know, I think it was maybe the Bosnian Muslim community, how do these people understand, from El Salvador and other countries, what we've just been through, the suffering, the loss? And I remember going to the moderator for the session that followed the first session. So the first session were two key South Africans talking about how they dealt with the past. And I could see the audience wasn't really engaged. They were listening, but not really engaged in it, right? It was just not connecting with them. But then the next panel was going to be on El Salvador. So one of the speakers is Joaquin Villalobos, the former head of the FMLN guerrilla movement, who the Economist said, or the FT said, was the Che Guevara of the Central American guerrilla insurgencies. A man named Ricardo Castaneda, who had been a negotiator for the very conservative government. And they were sitting there with this moderator from the New York Times. And I went to the moderator, who's a friend. I said, the first session didn't land. With the permission of the two Salvadorans, can you describe their background? And so when he introduced Joaquin, he talked about some really brutal things about what Joaquin had done during the war. People who had been killed, people close to him had been killed and tortured and cut up and left for him. And then he introduced Ricardo, and by then you can see everybody starting to pay attention because they understood this sort of trauma. And then he introduced Ricardo and said, when he had a reception at his house for the diplomatic community, I was invited, and I noticed in front of his house were a bunch of people looking really quite aghast. And there were about 7 labor leaders who were killed and eviscerated and laid out. And a number of people thought it must be from the guerrilla movement. He said, no, it's from right-wing paramilitaries who were against what the right-wing was government trying to, in negotiating a peace process. Now you had everybody in the room paying attention. And, you know, there's a saying, misery loves company, right? There is, wow. And then they listened into and engaged with how those two navigated through these experiences, not just their own, but in the society, in a very small country, relatively, and then how they ended up negotiating a peace agreement. And people listened. And so sometimes you have to, in our work, is curate conversations that get people to pay attention. And then they start sitting back and saying, okay, there is benefits, lessons learned in this shared experience model, and then quite frame it that way. And just one other example where there was immediate receptivity is when we did the first major conference in Belfast in 1995, and that's 3 years before the peace process, before the Good Friday Agreement. We brought in people from several countries, including 2 of the key negotiators from South Africa. And after they spoke, you know, Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness of Sinn Féin/IRA and other leaders came up to them and said, wow, who would have ever imagined 2 years ago that apartheid would have ended peacefully? And for you to do that and sit here as colleagues and friends gives us hope and encouragement. And, you know, and that's where there's an audience ready to listen and learn. In other places, people, as somebody said from El Salvador on a subsequent trip we did to Bosnia, he said, the war was ended by the international community in the Dayton Peace Accords. And he said, I don't think they were done killing each other. There was such anger and hatred. And so you have to go into each situation, as difficult as they are, and say, what is it we're trying to achieve? And what experience? Who are the people? How do you connect with them to really get them to stop and breathe and to think there is a different way?
They're powerful stories to listen to and think about, and I in anticipation of our talk, I've been thinking about some of the conflicts that are going on in the world right now, and trying it's because they're raw and in the middle of hostilities. It's a little bit easier to put ourselves in one side or the other and feel anger or hatred towards the other side. But in anticipation of our talk, I've been thinking about eventually these two sides are going to have to sit down and start working together and beginning a process of healing, and it might take a long time, but that hopefully will start happening soon. It doesn't. I'm not aware of it. Anything moving towards that direction, but I hope it does. Are you guys there thinking about that at all?
Yeah, and I love the way you framed it, because it's so true. The raw emotions right now are profound, and they're built on decades, if not generations, of trauma on both sides, which is, I think, what adds to this, and what adds to the fear and the anger and the uncertainty. So to answer your immediate question, we had done work actually in 1999 and 2000 at the request of then president of the Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat, to help prepare the new Palestinian Authority for governance. And we did a big conference in Gaza in 2000, like many of our other work, bringing in curated leaders to talk about how do you secure the foundations of a new state? Because with the peace agreement at that time, coming out of Oslo, there would be a Palestinian Authority, and it would rule the Gaza and the West Bank. And so, working in partnership with Harvard, we were developing a 3-year initiative to provide training and leadership development and skills for our new ministers, director generals, and others of the Palestinian Authority. But we launched it with this conference that brought in, again, leaders at different levels to talk about where do you go from here? How do you build a real effective state and government coming out of this history? And whether it was people from El Salvador, Northern Ireland, the Balkans, East Timor, other places that had similar types of challenges, had a lot to offer. And so that was, and then when the second Intifada broke out, that whole initiative collapsed. And then many years later, about 9 years ago, I was approached by 2 Israelis who were very involved as key negotiators in the second Camp David set of negotiations under President Clinton,
Mm-hmm.
in Taba, which happened later. And they came to me and they said, we haven't, even informally, unofficially, and they were no longer in government, but meeting with the key Palestinians who we know well, because we know the outlines of what it takes to get a 2-state solution. But there's no political will, frankly, on both sides, or capacity. And so we ended up convening with our South African colleagues a series of meetings and conversations in the region, and then later in South Africa, where our South African colleagues brought together all the key factions of the Palestinian leadership community, to talk about not only reconciliation within the Palestinian community, but with the goal of building and negotiating a 2-state future for Israel and Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
And that was making real progress on the Palestinian side, and we were also engaging with our Israeli colleagues. But the same government that's in charge in Israel today was also there. And until there was new leadership in the country, prepared to engage, prepared to actually make a 2-state future real, as difficult as that would be, as Bill Clinton learned, what are the other options? And what the Israelis had said to me at this point, and these are key former government officials,
Mm-hmm.
is as for Israel to remain a democracy and a homeland for the Jewish people, it needed to have a 2-state solution. So that's a bit of our background. And then that whole process ended when Donald Trump got elected president.
Mm.
And when I look at the situation now, I think the way you started this particular question is it's very difficult right now when the emotions are so raw, and when you have you really don't have any control over what's happening, either by the
Mm-hmm.
government or Hamas.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in terms of the work we've done around trauma in brain and behavioral science and tools that we've created, mostly starting with our Syrian colleagues who were in refugee camps in Jordan and in Central America, these resources that are trauma informed that can be deployed to people to deal with that. So that's the first thing. When you talk about healing, is recognizing the profound trauma that people are experiencing and the survivors and others will experience. And how do you address that as part of a community of people trying to, on both sides? Because you have 2 traumatized communities. And then to the longer point, I think it's stages, is healing. And part of healing is not only attending to people's psychic, emotional, physical trauma and loss, but there's also sort of political and emotional healing, where leaders have to step up and acknowledge and recognize within their own communities and across that divide that there's been a lot of loss and pain and suffering. And then how do we recognize that so that we can begin to build a process where this doesn't happen again?
Mm-hmm.
And not purely through a security lens, because you can never become completely secure,
Mm-hmm.
wherever. So it's like, how do you begin to build that foundation? And how do you allow leaders to emerge, not at just a national level, but the local level, who recognize that only together. And the one thing I'll say that I've learned over this work over the years, people I know who have survived torture, who have survived imprisonment and solitary confinement and torture within prison, emotional, physical, people who have been through, bombings, people who have survived, and I don't mean just in combat zones or conflict zones. I mean, people have gone through rape here in the US and elsewhere. People who have personally been through horrendous traumatic experiences never want revenge. They never want this even to be imposed on their worst enemy. And I think we have to always root how we heal in those who've had the experience of trying to rebuild themselves at a personal level, because they're the first to say, it's not revenge, it's not forgetting, but it's not revenge.
Mm-hmm.
And it's those who don't experience it who often become the most vocal in seeking revenge, outrage, anger. And I'm saying this globally, and here in the United States and elsewhere. So I think it is thinking about healing, but I also think it's about being rooted in the pragmatism of this will take time. And and you see these cycles. I remember Stefan de Mistura, who had been the UN Special Envoy for the Syrian peace talks, who we had done some work with a few years ago. He said, in my 4 decades in the UN, I would work in countries and see people rally around glorious defeats of their ancient past, centuries earlier. These experiences are rooted deeply, not only in narrative, even in people's, memories, but also there's evidence called epigenetic inheritance, that it shapes people. That sort of trauma, famine, genocide, for those who survive, shapes people in really profound ways.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So, I guess I want to ask a question about the neuroscientific approach that you guys incorporate, but I have one more before we get to that. In the early 90s, you took part in a conference that was post-communist in Eastern Europe. I'm interested to know how you got involved in this conference, and then what about that experience made you decide that there's something here and I want to. It basically led to a vision, I think, to develop this organization. Have I got that timeline right?
Yeah. Thank you, and thank you for doing some research and reading. Yeah. So in 1992, I organized and I brought people in a conference in Salzburg, Austria. On, I think the title was Justice in Times of Transition, and the subtitle was Transitional Justice.
Yeah, that sounds right.
And it was in February of 1992 in Salzburg, Austria, at a place called the Salzburg Seminar. And so in the late 80s, my interest, my curiosity, my creativity, my activism started in organizing some quote unquote fact-finding delegations to go to Central America. This is during the Reagan administration, to see firsthand what was going on in El Salvador, Nicaragua. We went to Costa Rica because they had a president, Oscar Arias, who was very involved in trying to promote a local peace process. And I reached out to, people like John Kenneth Galbraith, or the publishers and editors at the New York Times, the Washington Post, writers like a writer named James Carroll, the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, and so forth. And between 86, 87, and 89, I organized 2 or 3 of these fact-finding trips. And I was in my mid to late 20s. And, that's what I'm talking about, that sort of creative impulse, but actually connected to what do you do about it. And in that process, I realized, wow, I can come from a pretty humble background and actually connect with those who are leaders
Mhm.
and actually try to have an influence and impact on them. And that further opened up my interest, which I'd always had in World War II, the aftermath, the Civil War, Reconstruction, history. And then we saw the end of the Cold War. So I was actually on a trip to Central America, and I was with a guy named Rick Hertzberg, who was then the editor of the New Republic magazine. He came, and we were in Costa Rica towards the end of our trip, and we went to the Caribbean coast for 2 days of just at the beach. And
Mhm.
this is long before the internet and iPhones. And as we're driving, we stopped to get some food at a stand. And there was a 2-day-old newspaper, and in Spanish it says the wall came down. So
Wow.
here's the editor of the New Republic saying, he didn't speak. What wall came down? And somebody said, "Oh no, the Berlin Wall." And he's like, "You're kidding. We need to get to the airport." And the point was that you know, here we are I was doing this work in Central America, and then the Cold War is ending, and I then got invited to the Salzburg seminar. I met all these. This is 1991. All these dissidents who are now ministers of the environment, ministers of justice, and so forth. And in my conversations with them, I was asking, how do you deal with your past? You know, I know there's a lot of support coming in to write new constitutions, you know, build market economies, build democracies,
Mhm.
but you've been decades under repression. How do you deal with that? Like, what, as an individual? And that led to me with an incredible friend named Tim Ryback, who was then the deputy director of the Salzburg Seminar, coming up with this idea of a conference suggesting it be held in Salzburg that brought together the new leaders of these post-communist countries, not with quote unquote experts, you know, on constitutional design and all that, but people who themselves struggled from dictatorship to democracy. And who were the examples in 1991? There was Chile, Argentina, Brazil, some other Latin countries, Spain after Franco, and denazification in Germany were the few major examples. And so I ended up writing this concept note. It was very academic sounding. And it was called A Conference for Newly Emerging Democracies on Retroactive Justice. And
Mhm.
Tim and his colleagues connected me to George Soros, who I never heard of. Go to him. I have this idea. He liked it. He said he'd fund it. And then a friend of mine who is a local journalist said to me, as I was then writing a proposal for funding, he said, "This is a very academic sounding conference." And we came up with the subtitle Transitional Justice. And
Mhm.
scholars and others now say that's the first time that ever appeared in an article about our conference in Salzburg. But I thought it would be a one-off conference. And then I found, you know, we had people like Václav Havel and a who's who of leaders come together. And that's when the shared experience model was first sort of created for me. When all of a sudden people in the room say, with translators, we don't have a word for compromise as the American definition of give and take. To us, compromise is loss, it's humiliation, it's failure. And then just the scuttling about trying to come up with a translation in 5 or 7 or 10 different languages at this conference, it was like, oh, you know, they don't have a word for compromise. If they don't have that tradition or experience within their, you know, language, it's because it's not something that they've evolved to do on a regular basis. Now we can see it's failing in many places. And so that Salzburg conference sort of was the birthing moment of what became Beyond Conflict. And then in a very creative way, we moved on to a second and third and fourth conference. But it always, from the very beginning, was built on bringing together people from very different contexts, but who have struggled through a transition and thought about the moral, political, legal, cultural implications of these changes. And then as we grew, it's now considered by many scholars, historians, and others as really the catalyst for what became the field of transitional justice. And then, like
Mhm.
any here, a lot of other people came along. But it also, you know, really began to define our shared experience methodology. And And that's how it, I don't, that's maybe a long way of answering your question, but that's how the Salzburg Conference, and it was organized really out of my own curiosity and interest. And it goes back to, it's not like something I studied and there you do it. It's also part of the creative process.
That was great. That's what I was hoping to learn. And I think listening to the story, you deserve some credit too, not just for having the vision that putting people together in this way could be beneficial, but also going through the difficult stages of writing the proposal of what this idea is, and getting people to support this idea. All of these things take a number of different skills that you seem to combine together and brought this conference into being, and it was successful. So that's really a wonderful story of hard work and vision. So.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that, because for the longest time I was just doing and not reflecting. I mean, I was reflecting on the issues, but but I appreciate that. And you know, we're all at times can be our own worst enemies, and it's always good to stand back and say, wow, not only did I do this, if I can do it, others can do it. Just something. I mean, and I say that in a naive way, but thank you for saying that.
So when did Beyond Conflict start getting involved with cognitive scientists and neuroscientists to bring that aspect into your approach to, I guess, inform it in what science is telling us about our shared human nature and some of the causes of violence, for example, or conflict? How did you have a lot of colleagues and partners at different universities? So when did you start bringing those people in?
Well, thank you. So, you know, I mentioned earlier that at the core of our approach in the beginning is the power of the shared human experience, right? Rooting it in the lived experience of people who really, by necessity and then creativity and drive and vision, you know, thought differently about the nature of their conflict or the transition they were in or hoped to create. And so over the years, as we would work in different countries, we would sort of spin the globe, as I would say, and say, what's the relevant experience and who are the best people for this particular context in this country, what they're going through. So it's very much rooted in that model of shared experience. And so it's very much about the human experience. And then I was teaching, to get to the science, a course with a colleague at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And it was called Conflict Transformation in the 21st Century, the Human Dimension. So it connects to that same theme. And every other class I'd have a speaker come in. And so one class I had Jerry Adams come in from Northern Ireland. And a student raised her hand and said, how do you sit across the table from somebody you may have tried to kill? Or they may have killed somebody very close to you. And he paused and he said, you know, it's tough to make peace with a humiliated partner. And what I recall, there was a retired neuroscientist sitting in the room. This is a guy probably in his early 70s, so he had a long career as a scientist. And he had just been observing the classes. And after this class, he came up to me and said, you know, I've heard in this class, in other classes here, themes of humiliation, fear, empathy. And he said, there's a lot of brain and behavioral science research behind these emotional processes. And I said, what do you mean, you know, brain science research? Because I knew some of the social psychology research. I knew what I observed, what I experienced. And he said something so profound and so just perfect. He said, well, speaking as a scientist, he said, we are not rational beings with emotions. In fact, we're just the opposite. We're emotionally based beings who can only think rationally when we feel that our identities as we see them are understood and valued by others. And I was just like, as the British say, gobsmacked. I said, wow. and then we ended up, because living nearby, having lunches, breakfasts, and dinners, and I was picking his brain. And finally, he said, "You should talk to some of these local universities." And I met in a lab at MIT an incredible colleague who unfortunately passed away, Emile Bruneau, in the lab of another young, brilliant scientist, Rebecca Sachs. And I started hearing things that both excited me and reinforced the, what I thought, which is, that we discount human cognition and emotion and think that everything at the end of the day can be thought through reason and rationality. The whole notion of the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, is, as a friend of mine says, you suspend, the value of doubt is more important than anything else until you have evidence. And here I was hearing at MIT from brain and behavioral scientists, they would say, we need to focus on how we think, not what we think, because most of how we think is below the level of conscious access. 90 or more than 90% of how we think is below the level of conscious access. That we think automatically in milliseconds, we think in groups, and we think of these mental models of the world like an internal GPS system that comes on really starting between 4 and 8 years of age. And that's our internal navigation system. And then our brains evolved to be predictive and not reactive, because we're all the descendants, as Emile used to say, of those people who learn not to pause and ask the question, y'all think that's a Pride Alliance? We're the descendant of people who said, that's a Pride Alliance. We need to be very careful here, right? And so, and not just unique to humans, all living organisms here have learned to predict their social and physical environment. And for survival. And then the other thing is hearing these professors at MIT in the cognitive sciences say, we are producing every year PhDs in economics and political science who are still taught fundamentally that humans are rational beings and discount cognition and emotion. I think, well, what else is there? We either think or we feel. And so we were burdened, I'm thinking more broadly, by this deeply archaic view of human nature. And so what I was thinking about at the time, and I did a conference back in Salzburg in the late 90s with my friend Tim, looking at intractable conflict, fragile peace, and durable peace. And the question is, what are we missing? Why are so many conflicts intractable? Nobody talked about brain and behavioral science in that conference. And now I realized, over a decade ago, that we need to understand human cognition and emotion if we're going to figure out how to address conflict and reconciliation and social cohesion and change in more effective ways with real evidence. And so that's what began the journey. And it started by sort of bootstrapping this work, working with MIT. We would do conferences at the MIT Media Lab as a venue, not in partnership with them. And the first one was on neuroscience and social conflict. Next one was on dehumanization. The third was on norms, narratives, and neurons, and on and on. And in each one, I didn't just want scientists there. I wanted people with real lived experience. I wanted practitioners. I wanted journalists. I wanted policymakers to come to these, to learn what these scientists know and what they don't know. And that's where it began. And then over the years, I was able to raise some money to build this sort of innovation lab within Beyond Conflict and form partnerships with probably a dozen or more universities around the world, and really create a model for how to bring this body of work to the world. And then how do you connect it all? Because there is no connective tissue between the research and practice. And my colleague Emile, before he passed away, said that's what we've been doing. And I think still is a big part of that. And I'll just end on this particular point when he said that if you're a cell biologist and you're doing really important work sort of anonymously in a lab, and you make an important discovery, there is this whole pipeline through clinical trials, through medical research universities, through funding and economic incentives from pharmaceuticals and others to take that finding and put it into a system that you can test, and it may save a life. Well, if you're a brain and behavioral scientist and you're working on how do we process sacred values, what is really how empathy is processed in the brain? What about dehumanization, or finding that we process disgust differently than fear? All these things may get put in an academic peer review article, and then boom, nothing gets translated and nothing making an impact in the world. And it's that connective tissue has been a big part of what we're trying to do.
Wow, that's a great way for, I guess, for me to visualize what you guys are working on there. I think that was very well explained.
Well, when you think of the Americas Divided, my report is a good model of that. So actually, before the 2016 election, around 2014, 15, we were looking at deepening polarization. And we were saying, okay, how do we understand the psychology of deepening polarization? And so Emil had moved from MIT to UPenn. And so, again, we sort of bootstrapped it. And then when we got some funding to build out this innovation lab, we dedicated a fair chunk of funding where he could hire 2 postdocs and do a lot of research saying, okay, well, polarization is becoming identity-based. And then we know when that happens, all these unconscious psychological processes come online. But then it's like, okay, that's a really good, helpful explanation. What do we do about it? And so Emil used to love this idea of intervention tournaments. So like a hackathon where you bring together researchers and say, if we can design an intervention and test it, what ideas do you have? And so we did one. And one of the ideas somebody had, what if we apply research and meta misperceptions, which could apply to a range of things, to the issue of polarization? And we grabbed upon that. And then at UPenn, did a series of surveys and found that people misperceive by Democrats or Republicans, the gap between them on big issues like immigration, abortion, gun control, but also how much they think the other side dislikes them and how much they think the other side dehumanizes them. And so the team at UPenn did all this really important research, got it published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is the blue chip academic publication with very minor edits to the paper. And meanwhile, we worked with designers and consultants to come up with the Americas Divided Mind report, how to get that out the world, and then socialize that. Ezra Klein wrote about it, many others, David Brooks, and it's really helped shape a field. Both practitioners, how they think about identity-based polarization. I was thrilled to learn the last 2 or 3 years that scholars, scientists now look at the impact and the role of meta misperceptions in addressing polarization. And then we developed interventions through a video intervention that was rated by Stanford in the Strengthening Democracy Challenge as having the biggest impact in reducing support for political violence in the United States. And so that's an example of initiating the research, getting the funding, and not just saying, okay, great academic research, but how does it translate into impact? And depending on the meta misperceptions, getting that out there so other people can follow on this, but then turning it into these sort of public-facing reports and pushing and following up on it, even today, 4 years later.
The misperceptions people have of what the other side thinks of them, I think the results of this need to be shared as widely as possible. And on Beyond Conflict's website, you have a video of doing this with people, right? And seeing their reactions when they realize that someone, let's say a Democrat, realizes that a Republican doesn't think nearly as bad as them as they originally thought. And it's also you mentioned this America's Divided Mind report. That's at the moment a free PDF that people can download from your Beyond Conflict's website.
Yeah, and also that video, it's for people to use widely and share it. And if they need to reach us at Beyond Conflict, we can make it available. There's even a Christian evangelical group who turned that into an animated video and framed it in, biblical verses about the prodigal son, thinking that his father would never accept him. And then when he goes home, his father fully embraces him. Then he realizes, as the narrator pointed out, that he had a profound meta-misperception and that it was corrected, and then relates it to this research and mentions our research, and then, brings it back to, what the Bible calls for. And that's reaching thousands of people in churches. And so this research can be, tailored to certain communities and languages that they really respond to. And we also live in an ecosystem of social media, and so forth that unfortunately reinforce the worst views of the other. And yet we know, people are much more connected in positive ways than they realize.
I'm aware that I think we're running out of time, so perhaps if it's all right with you, I'll just ask one more question as a way of closing. I'm interested in keeping up to date with what Beyond Conflict's going to be doing over the next year, working in America with the upcoming election, and I think dealing with issues of polarization and hopefully having another successful election, and if there's a transition of power, a successful transition of power as well. People are interested in following or keeping up to date with what Beyond Conflict's doing throughout this process. What are the organization's plans for the upcoming year, and how can people follow that?
Well, thank you. Well, as a nonprofit, we can't be engaged, as you can imagine, in partisan issues. We have to be nonpartisan. But I think this particular election is really one about the future of democracy and our civic responsibility. And so one of the things we've been doing is we have this initiative called Where Do We Go From Here? That brings leaders who sat across profound divides from other countries to the United States, like we brought them to other countries around the world. And so in January, with two colleagues, Rolf Meyer, who had been the key negotiator in the talks to end apartheid, and Mohammed Baba, who had been a leading ANC activist and sat across the other side, we went to upstate New York, Rochester, Buffalo, and then went to Cleveland, and met with a range of people from the left, the right, the center, to faith leaders, to community groups, to the mayors of Cuyahoga County, 54 of them, which includes Cleveland and all the cities and towns around it. And then we did a lot of local media. We did local radio and television. We even did a morning broadcast on the local news in between weather and sports, and trying to reach as many people as possible. And there was a huge hunger for this, to think like, wow, we need leadership we're not getting here, that shows us that we can get through this, that shows us that, that you're not surrendering your values to sit across the table from somebody who has profoundly different political views. But what you have to share in common is a belief in the rule of law, democracy, and the Constitution we have, and respect for that, and those democratic norms. Because without that, nobody's protected. And then this past October, November, we took Rolf Muhammad and went to Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and South Carolina, and did the same thing, and had incredible conversations with a wide range. And we also went to colleges and universities, and that same appetite for inspiration, modeling, that we can get through this, but that they would say, have to get through this. You can't rely on others, right? You have to get involved. And one of the key messages, which I think I talked about earlier, is in South Africa, for example, and in Northern Ireland, and again, using those two examples, the way the transition from apartheid was achieved and the way the Good Friday Agreement was achieved is parties across the divide realized that what they had in common were certain principles of a democracy based on the rule of law, in a constitution or constitutional-like system, in which you can defend and promote your political interest through this democratic model. And that in this turbulent period, you needed to cooperate with each other. You needed to build a center of stability. And you define what we need a center, not a group of moderates, but a place where the left, the right, the center can come together. I think of it as almost like a physical place, a center, a meeting point where people can come together to get through this difficult time, and really to push to the extremes, that exist on both sides, and get through this. Because without that sort of partnership, then the worst can happen. And I look at it right now in a way I never imagined. Liz Cheney and Jamie Raskin, or Liz Cheney and Rachel Maddow, and many others are coming together with profoundly different political views. But I have the courage to say, we need this system, as imperfect as it is, to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And without the rule of law, without democracy and respect for democratic values and norms, we will fall to authoritarianism, dictatorship. And so what we're looking at is, how do you bring not in a nonpartisan way, this message? Because leaders abroad are deeply concerned that if the United States goes off the track, it has global implications in very destructive ways.
Yeah, I think
and so. Yeah, and so that's one of them is sharing these lessons in ways that people across these divides can see it and say, yeah, this is a model of how we get through this time. And then we're continuing to do additional research, and we are working with this brilliant researcher on sort of a study and a report called America's Search for Meaning. How do we make meaning? Not just from a literature point of view, but psychologically, why do we need to make meaning in our lives? How does it root us? How does it guide us? And again, very much focused on something that's tangible, that is accessible for all, no matter where they come from.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I feel quite good, actually, listening to that optimism and the fact that when you go around the country to different places and talk about these things, you get the kind of responses that you get. If things were as terrible as sometimes they seem, I think we wouldn't even see those kinds of reactions from people, but you're seeing them all around the country. So I think that's an optimistic sign that things.
Well, it goes back to the research, Tyrel, we did that people overestimate. There is a friend of mine, I can't remember which country, said to me a couple of years ago, don't forget that most people in every country are not political. They don't wake up thinking about their political identity every day.
Yeah.
And they want the system to work. They may have different political views, but it doesn't define who they are in a daily sort of way. Now, when you live under repression, when you live under political dysfunction, you become much more aware. It creates anxiety, instability, and stress. But, we can get through this when people recognize the threat, when they recognize that they can't stand aside, when they have to involve, but they also have to root it in a recognition of a meeting place in which you're not surrendering your principles, but you're claiming the value of a democratic rule of law system, that people have to come together, right? Only through cooperation, where there's shared benefit, which is the system surviving, that you get through this. And I think that's one of the key messages that we're trying to get out.
Great. Well, Beyond Conflict has just last year celebrated its 30th anniversary. Is that right?
Yep.
So,
Yeah.
congratulations on reaching
Actually,
that and still.
yeah, last year,
And I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with me about this. I really enjoyed listening to what you have to say on these topics and learning about what you guys have been doing for the past 30 years. And I hope that sometime in the future, somewhere down the road, we can find the chance to pick up where we left off today and maybe talk again. And
I would love that.
sometime after the election, for example.
Yeah,
we
or
could-
maybe just before the election in the next few months. No, I really enjoyed your questions. They're very thoughtful and help me think. And also just the way you approach this, I think, is very constructive. I think you have to go into it rooted in an understanding of humanity and its all its flaws and aspirations. I think too often it's understandable people come from it from strong points of view and they expect a certain point of view, and the reality is only together in the most broadest sense can we get through anything.
Mhm.
Right. And
Yeah.
And I love the way you approach this. So what are your plans now are you going to, do you put this interview out at some point? Please let me know. And if there's any follow-up or information, I or Summer can get it to you.
Okay, great. Yeah, plan to in the next week or so to put this on YouTube, our discussion, and I'll let you know when it goes up. That's all right with you, I assume.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me too. Thank you. Talk to you again.
Happy holidays.
Same to you. Bye-bye.
Bye.